So good evening, everyone. And Rasha, I'm very happy today, actually.
Yeah, me too.
Media tech companies like us, normally agencies ask a lot of questions to ask, right? So today I'll be asking a lot of questions to you. Yeah, so awesome. So that's a great beginning. Rasha, I'm
And it's great to be physically with people. It's been a very, very long time. So thanks for having us and for organizing this.
great. Thank you. Um, Rasha, my first question, of course, I understand you belong to a very, very uh, data-centric genre, actually. So my first question is actually about data.
Yeah.
Almost data has been a gold rush for us in the industry. Everybody in the room would probably believe in us that everyone is at this moment trying to understand how do we get this data in, for the consumers. But the fact remains that my question to you is, how does one creatively and scientifically use data to build meaningful relationship with consumers? Lifetime value, as we talk, sustainability, long-term growth. How does brands or agencies today use data effectively and scientifically, right?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's undoubtedly we are living in the golden age of marketing. Data in the digital and in the connected, age is certainly enabling marketers to make much more informed decisions, faster decisions, deliver on scale, drive a lot of efficiencies, so all the things that we all know. But I was having this conversation with Asif as we were talking through what we want to cover, and I was telling him about a recent book that I've read for Rishabh Tubakawala. For those of you who may not know, Rishabh Tubakawala is a great writer. He's one of those, avant-garde early adopters of digital. He helped us start Starcom IP some 25 years ago. Brilliant guy, brilliant thinker, and innovator. But what Ishad wrote, he wrote a really interesting book, and I just want to share the name of the book. It's called Restoring the Soul of Business, Staying Human in the Age of Data. And basically what the book really advocates for is that the promise of any kind of digital transformation can only be realized when we find the right kind of balance with what we promise our people. And I think this was, really important because in many ways he's saying we need to find that combination between the emotion, the data, the digital and the analog, between the human and the machine. And I think the emphasis here is on the and not the or of anything, So, I think the first thing that the marketing community within the CPG industry needs to start thinking about and needs to answer for is, who are we really trying to connect with? Especially when we talk about long-term sustainable growth. And in what he argues, and I kind of agree with that because I was doing a lot of research and trying to understand the bigger trends and influences from a mindset and values of what the Generation Z consumers are like. But more importantly, Alpha. I do have 2 kids that fit into that generation, and I'm trying to stay relevant, hopefully, for them. But that aside, he argues, are we actually marketing to the consumer or are we actually marketing to the citizen? And these 2 things are quite distinct, very, very distinct. Marketing to a consumer is ensuring that we deliver a sale. And it tends to have a very short-term goal. It's very transactional, I need to make sure in the next quarter we deliver whatever it is that we need to deliver. Marketing to a citizen, on the other hand, puts the value beyond just looking at the lifetime value of the consumer and starts to make marketers think about the lifetime value of their organizations and, more importantly, of the brand. And this is where, and I know that we've had, or you've probably had many of these discussions about the future, you start to think about the role of purpose-led marketing. What do we really stand for? What are we really trying to be, all about? And how do we ensure that we are being really, authentic and true to who we are, also as brands? And I think very often these questions don't fit into short-term Excel sheets, which is very often the pressures that a lot of us as marketers go through. But certainly they're the kind of questions that are becoming increasingly important for this generation and the next generation. And I think as I was doing this research, I dug up this really interesting also research that's done by Edelman. And they look at something called the trust barometer. And they've done one for this year, actually, 2021, in the UAE. And I want to just dig out one interesting data point that I pulled out of that report that says, and this is coming from 1,500 consumers, so pretty reasonable sample. So 64% of consumers here in the UAE agree that consumers today have the power to force corporations to change the way they do things. Good insight, huh? To give us a little bit of an insight of where the future is actually, is really heading. So,
interesting.
Long answer, but the short answer, it's all short answer.
Interesting answer.
To build it, it needs to be long, and you need to build, trust over time and real human connections, and really not look at consumers in binary numbers.
Just because you brought up the AI and machine learning subject in here, my next question probably is that how do consumers are evolving, and I think we all understand that the consumers are evolving, but how do we now look at what data matrix do we look now? I'm sure the hygiene matrix, I think we're done with. We're going to be following it anyways, but then what do we look beyond the regular, and how are we going to be future ready in terms of data?
Yeah. So I think if there's anything that we've learned about humanity over the last 24 months is that we are probably the most adaptive and adoptive, species on this planet. We always adopt new ways to survive, really. That's just been our mechanism. And I think it's not any different for brands. Brands really need to have a very agile, adaptive, and adoptive culture in order for them to stay relevant for the future, but also for now, not necessarily just the future, because the future feels very close. So I think if we look at so people are welcoming hundreds of platforms into their lives every day and every year. And if you look at it, 7 out of 10 of those platforms today are probably one of the most valuable companies, in the world. So just think of that as a context. So the way that we look at it is mainly from a horizontal marketplace. Think of it, you've got a buyer and you've got a seller. So in a marketplace, they're often winning by looking at, commerce, but also the fight for the attention economy, the human attention economy, right? So they basically are learning from people, based on their attention, and then they kind of share and rent those insights to CPGs so that we can make more and better and more informed decisions. So I was thinking that essentially why their platforms are able to win is because, one, they're obviously very data rich, and we all know that. The second thing I think that they do very well is that they have a network effect. They're able to drive personalization and a personalized ecosystem, and they have a D2C offering. I mean, that kind of closes the entire customer journey and the entire loop for you. But I think for a lot of CPGs, they then in that context need to think of themselves and make 3 decisions, really. It's either you fail or you partner or you build when it comes to looking at future readiness of data. And so for them to really, I think, drive some form of growth, they need to start thinking of how do they navigate and unlock growth in an increasingly in the platform era, in the platform world. And the way we view it as a group is that they need to see themselves as a living business idea or a living business idea. In other words, really connecting what the brand makes with who they are, with how they produce, with the entire ecosystem and their entire value chain. So that's one aspect of, I think, a bit of a paradigm shift in how CPGs need to think. The other thing that I think is very important as well is that data in the absence of any sort of contextualization is just a number. It's got absolutely no value. So we kind of go back also to basics of humanity. Humans have always been very curious and looking at a data point and asking the question of why. What makes people respond to whatever we're putting out there the way they are? What are the things that truly matter for them? How do we actually drive the engagement? How do we actually add that sort of value? I think is going to be really key for us to start thinking of how we unlock not just the business outcomes, which are very important, but also the human outcomes, because,
Interesting. So now we move to the consumer journey aspect of it. I think Sham just covered up a bit here. But obviously with COVID days, the low funnel marketing, I guess, is in an emergence. And I think it's logical, right? We're all moving towards that. Every consumer is moving towards the e-commerce way. The question is, a lot of brands today are focusing either completely on the lower funnel marketing or are doing more of lower funnel marketing or acquisition marketing, whatever you will call it. Do you see a potential risk there, or do you think this is optimal enough for brands on CPG?
I mean, look, there's undoubtedly all brands, but particularly also CPGs, since we're speaking CPGs, had a very, very difficult 2 years in many ways. They've had a lot of gains, but at the same time, from marketing on the upper funnel, I think in times of difficulties and a pandemic, you don't want to feel or sound very opportunistic when you're engaging. So add to that a lot of uncertainties when they have to make certain kind of decisions, disrupted business models, and economic and in some cases challenges when it comes to their production lines. So they've really had to make really difficult decisions. And the pressure on growth, I suppose, is the reason why for a while they were focusing on the end of the funnel and really short-term gains. But I feel it's called short-term for a reason, because it is short-term. If you're really focused on marketing to a very smart consumer or citizen, if we want to adopt that new word, but marketing to a very smart consumer, they'll really see right through this. The relationship between the brand and the consumer becomes very transactional and incredibly generic, because it becomes, whoever reaches me first, whoever, it's very, very transactional and generic. So I think that, again, going back to, if there's anything that we've learned, brands really need to start thinking about ways to really, adapt and stay relevant. But I think more importantly, it becomes increasingly important to actually market throughout the funnel and drive relevance and impact throughout the funnel, because storytelling and way of differentiating becomes more important. Powering AI and personalization at scale becomes very important. So I think, if anything, this entire disruption has provided CPGs with an opportunity to think about the full funnel, as opposed to just think about just the lower part of the funnel or short-term gains, as opposed to long-term sustainable growth.
But how does a brand today find a balance between the two?
Yeah,
and that's a very, very important question.
Yeah,
I mean, we all understand low funnel marketing is important, and we all understand brand awareness is important.
Yeah,
but how does a CPG brand actually create a balance between the two?
Yeah. So earlier on, I think we talked about unlocking growth in the platform world mindset. Yeah, different way of actually completely thinking. And they're really like 4 imperatives, if you want, that fit into the customer journey of how brands need to actually think. So I think the first thing we need to think about is finding those people that are gonna, that we need to market to and that are relevant to us. And under the how do you actually do it? You find customers through, scaled smart media is one way of doing it. Dynamic personalization in a manner that's very relevant, across your paid channels is one way of doing it. When we find the audience, the second thing that we think about is that, how much do I really know about those people? So the second stage in our mind is that, how much do I really know you? And I think here, the biggest challenge that CPGs will have is the notion of real identities. Can they really get to the core identity? And I think this is why, again, I'm speaking from my group perspective, when 3 years ago we decided to invest in buying out Epsilon, it was really because we were trying to future-proof that model, right? Because they specialize in building core IDs and enabling, brands to really play more effectively in that space. So linking that again to people's motivations and desire lines becomes really important, because, as I said, it's not just about the data, but it's about the curiosity to understand the layers. So we've learned, or we now know you a little bit more. Next natural thing is that, how do I actually engage with you? And that can be through different things, disruption, dynamic creative, and there's so many ways of really thinking about, moment marketing, being relevant across the consumer journey and slicing that whichever and however you find it relevant. And I think the last part, which is quite important as well, is the own part. So you need to think about ways of, orchestrating personalized experiences across the purchase funnel. I think that is incredibly important, and channel and drive that to commerce. Commerce is one part, but also your own relationships, which is, again, the D2C part that I think a lot of brands are thinking and trying to solve for.
Super. So that brings us to the content aspect of it then. Since we're talking about content here, I mean, what are the new dimensions of CPG marketing when it comes to content? Because we're seeing platforms today and we're seeing video marketing today is a challenging space here. Reels, Instagram, TikTok, a maximum 4 seconds, 5 seconds, I've heard consumers telling me they're lengthy.
Yeah.
The 5-second videos are lengthy. How do we, as brand marketers today, cope up with this entire thing? And what is your suggestion to this entire new content marketing strategy?
Yeah. I think this is going to be the longest answer, but I'll try to be brief. I think, first of all, we need to accept and realize video is there to deliver what video does best. Ultimately, video is there to represent that human need for connection, for telling stories, for driving the empathy and engagement, right? That's ultimately what content and video does, and does really, really well. Now, brands that build that sense of community, that sense of, reliability and participation, I think, are the ones that will set themselves to actually win, in this new tech age. For CPG in specific, I think there's a few things that we need to be thinking about and to keep in mind. So staying top of mind for CPG is something that is really important, and I think that will be primarily driven through, the kind of experiences that we create, and that experience does not necessarily have to only live in the digital ecosystem, although it's very important. It can live anywhere really, whether it's in store or in a commerce site or wherever it is. Really, the most important thing, obviously, is that how memorable and engaging is that experience. Are we able to resonate with people? And I think that's very important. So the future is definitely interactive, and if CPGs are able to layer that with the journey and lead to, as I said, to a commerce or to a transaction at the end, I think that's a big leapfrog for a lot of players. Now, having said that, there are a few things that that we can actually think about and keep in mind when it comes to content. One is interactive video will continue to gain momentum. Absolutely, I think we've seen that. Things like live streaming drives a lot more authenticity. It's something that is trackable. Passive video on its own will never be enough to build consideration. Let's be real. What can you do within 5 seconds, right? So it's just about finding the right kind of balance on how we drive participations through AR, through VR, through 360 video platforms. There's just endless opportunities that we can obviously talk about. The second thing that I wanted to talk about here as well is gaming as a platform, because gaming in specific is growing exponentially. So I was looking again at some statistics, the researcher and me. We have 480, the population in MENA is 480 million people. 100 million of those are actually gamers. If we look at the compounded growth rate that is projected for Saudi Arabia alone over the next 5 years, it's set to grow at 22.5%. Massive, massive opportunity. So where is the space for CPGs to actually play? The space really for them is think of how they can weave their narratives within that. Think of the icons as part of these experiences. I mean, again, I've got endless notes over here, but we won't go through that. I heard someone earlier on talk about the metaverse. Sorry, I can't remember who it was, but think of the metaverse is already there and within the gaming platforms, and I think the reason why that becomes worth investment for a lot of CPGs is because impressions in gaming they don't come in like single digits. They're much bigger than that. So just something for CPGs to think about. The third thing is like shoppable content. I think that is incredibly important, and it's a growth area. Stopping at engaging content, as I said, is never going to be enough. So I think for CPGs, there's a real opportunity to work very closely with content creators, to work very closely with influencers, and also realize that this is an always-on strategy. This is not something seasonal. We do when we are launching, we do, at one-off. It needs to be ongoing. And that the review culture is going to continue to actually grow. So again, how do they think about that and actually driving, engagements? And the fourth thing that I want to leave you with in this particular one is, again, goes back to personalization, because that will definitely drive impact across the entire funnel. And AI will continue to transform that personalization to drive better performance. But I think that one thing I think that's really, really important is that very often CPGs, when we produce content, it's so polished. And I think if you look at the generation or when we talk about driving authenticity, going back to what we discussed earlier on, it does not need to be as polished, because I think the more it feels that it's organically sourced, the more it's authentic is the feeling. The last thing is just really take risks. I mean, it really is a cultural and a mindset shift in how you operate your entire business. So.
Great, super. Just before we move into the next question, on the same front, your take on storytelling now, is it going to be more difficult for brands?
My take on?
Storytelling. Is it going to be more difficult for brands now?
No. Why would it be more difficult for brands?
Just because the content is much brief. And
I think it would really in my point of view, it really depends on what the brand is trying to communicate and who it's communicating to. If anything, it has the opportunity, as I said, to look at the storytelling from different angles and different perspectives, depending on where the consumer is on that journey. That's ultimately, and also the relevance of the story that they're actually trying to tell.
Super.
Yeah.
All right. So last round, very quick. We need to understand your future predictions on these marketing trends. You could call it a fire. I mean, you could speed up as much as you want.
Yes. You told me 2 words. What else?
Right. Yeah. You could be as brief as you want. Yeah. Contextual marketing.
Relevance drives receptivity.
Super. Real-time marketing.
Allows you to predict, allows you to anticipate, and you need to be very intuitive when you're looking at it.
AI-powered optimization.
Performance, scale. It's great. It's what we do.
Programmatic advertising. Where do you see the future?
Efficient, effective, right people, right time. marry that with, commitment and performance on outcome and leading business outcomes, you've got a magic formula.
Conversational marketing.
I think it's very much the now and the future. Honestly, you can just ask my son. Everything is voice as far as he's concerned.
Perfect. We did very well for our time.
Just in time. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thanks a lot, Asif.
Thank you.